Therefore, I would like to assign this discussion to you all to research what other bills have before we move forward with more discussion.
And Sandy seconds. Jeff? Campbell?
Sorry. I know we're a little out of order with this, but Andrew Norton, who many of you know is the legislative liaison for the Department of Rehabilitation Services, so he just pointed out that our bylaws do say that any amendments to the bylaws, there should be written notice of any proposed amendment, and that should be given to each member at least 30 days prior to such meeting. So we can do some additional research, but any written amendment will have to then be shared with the board 30 days before we take any vote on it.
So Jeff had asked that we table the discussion. This is Barbara. Jeff had asked that we table, so I think that we will actually hold off on the motion while we do some research.
Barbara, to be honest, if we follow what's written, then the proposal cannot stand, so it's dead until we have something in writing. So I think we should just move on.
Okay, that's fine. We'll do the research and we'll put the topic on the next agenda and then try to follow the protocols. Thank you.
Is there any other new business? Christina?
And now that we've just had this discussion, I might have to hold this to our next meeting. But one of the things I would like the advisory board to consider is starting to create a video log of our agenda, our minutes, and also creating a summary of what happens at this meeting. After the September meeting, myself, Sandy Nzinga, and Alexandra McGee just sat in the cafeteria and made a short little summary of what happened at the meeting. We were able to, we added captions to that, so we had both access to that. There was no voice interpretation. But what we would like to do is, it was just a short, brief summary, and we had over 200 of our community members view that video. And I think that's a really important thing to find and to do to allow our community members access to what happens to this meeting. Also, the government website is very difficult to navigate, and trying to help our community members find where that agenda is, where our minutes to the meetings are located, is pretty difficult. So I would like to have the advisory board create a video log, have someone add captions to it and post that both on the government website, but also be able to have a link. I don't know, I guess my question is also, does the government have a YouTube page or a Facebook page that we could can get a link, and or can we start that, please?
Yeah. Christina was nice enough to give the co-chairs a heads up that this would be coming up. So we have started our research to find out whether we can even post video aside from the YouTube channel, which I don't think we're quite there yet, but even being able to post video to the Secretary of State's website. We haven't found a mechanism to do that, so we will continue to research, but if you have ideas, you know, we may need an interim solution. And it sounds like the community and the organizations here were able to do some of those pieces, and we may need to do that collectively and figure out the best way to approach it as a board. But we don't have the mechanism to do that right now.
And can I please make a motion to add this to our next agenda to discuss this further at our next meeting?
Do we have a second to that motion?
It's Alexandra, I second. Daniel is also showing a second.
Okay, all in favor of adding this to the next meeting agenda? Anyone opposed? Abstentions? You got the abstention. Great.
Okay. Any other new business? If none, Then I would like to make a proposal. Now that we have a new governor, I would like for us as the advisory board, I would like us to be proactive, to be prepared for any possible upcoming storms or weather-related issues, to make sure that we have interpreters with the governor whenever there are any sort of emergency announcements in the state. So maybe we need to check into that with the new governor.
So I would be more than happy to take the lead on that and then get back to the group. I don't see it being an issue, and I'm sure as having the commissioner here, and hopefully she continues to be the commissioner in the next session, will also bring it to the governor's attention. So I don't see it being an issue at this point.
Thank you. This is Barbara. I'd like to go ahead with the legislative agenda at this point. We will start with the captioning, and I will ask Sandy and Zinga to please stand. Sandy, before we go ahead, I would actually like to mention what the 4 proposals will be. After the proposal is presented, we will be open for questions from board members. At the end of the meeting, the last half hour of the meeting, we will open for public comments. Okay, Sandy, go ahead. This is Sandy. At the last meeting, I made a proposal for public access to caption it as a public access bill. The bill as presented, there have been no changes, and I think that it's ready to go. Mrs. Barber, any comments or questions? Seeing none? Thank you, Sandy. Next on the agenda, we have the interpreter bill, but I'm actually going to move that to our last discussion. So I would like to now go to Jeff Braven for the legislative.
At the last meeting, we talked about the language assessment for all deaf and hard of hearing children from ages 0 to 21. There were 1 or 2 comments that we wanted to make sure that we reviewed with the Department of Public Health and State Department of Education. Both of those discussions have happened, and there's no other changes to the bill because everybody seems to be on board with what we're moving forward with. There are some concerns in terms of how the data information is going to be transferred between agencies, but that bill will promote that to happen. So there are no other changes from our last meeting, and I think the bill is ready to move forward.
Mrs. Barber, any discussion or questions from the board? None? Oh, excuse me. Susan.
My name is Susan Yankee, and Jeff and I had discussed this with the safety legislation, but in the second page that you gave us, there's a section B on how that the assessments would be administered, and it says, all assessments shall be presented in the child's primary language and mode of communication as identified in the child's language and communication plan. As we know, that is only given to children that have individualized education plan. If your child is deaf or hard of hearing or deaf blind, they are not entitled to get a language and communication plan. So a large group of students will be left out. So in a minute, I'm going to be proposing a change to that to include all students with a 504 plan so that they have accessibility and that you can assess them as well.
I'd like to respond. I am 100% in favor of this, but currently the legislation for the language and communication plan is focusing only on students with IEPs. I know there is other legislation that we'll be discussing later on that Susan and I have worked with to make sure that 504 students are included with the language and communication plan. Once that passes, then that language assessment bill can add the 504 students.
So if I may, from a legislative point of view, I think it would be more complicated if you added the 504 later. Even though I don't think enough people understand the difference of when someone goes from an IEP to a 504 in middle school, and I think that might complicate it, and I would be afraid that you would lose it. So my suggestion would be, and this group has the power to do whatever they want, I would say you add it at the beginning and let it get worked out through the committee at that point.
The one thing that has to be, Colleen Hales from the State Department of Ed, the one thing that has to be considered is the issue, as Jeff stated, that the requirement for a language and communication plan for students who are deaf or hard of hearing applies right now only to students who are identified under IDEA as requiring special education services. And that language and communication requirement is located only in a bill, legislation that addresses the IEP. That's the way it was passed originally. If people remember the history, there was a move to go with the Deaf Child Bill of Rights at that time. And I believe in the end the compromise was that there would be a requirement for using the language and communication plan within the IEP. The issue is that 504 students do not have an IEP. So that just is something that needs to be considered in terms of what the current requirements are for the language and communication plan.
So I guess my question would be to SDE, right? So what is the current practice for the 504 students at this point?
It's identified in our guidance as a recommended practice for students who have a 504 plan. It's a recommended best practice, but the Department of Education does not collect data. We don't have any way of identifying who the 504 students are across the state who may be deaf or hard of hearing. That piece belongs at the Office of Civil Rights, and there is no data collection at this point that would even allow us to say how many students are across the state who may qualify for accommodations under a 504 plan that are deaf or hard of hearing. So right now the guidance is that districts can use the plan as part of their best practices in developing a 504 plan for deaf or hard of hearing students.
I think, okay, you've got two over there that might know better.
Just to give a little more background information, the 504, as Colleen mentioned, is under the Office of Civil Rights, which is at the federal level and not the state. So the federal has full control of that. Now, there is an effort by deaf and hard of hearing community members now to bring up a bill called the Alice Cogswell and Ann Sullivan Macy Act. And that's a combination of deaf and hard of hearing and deaf blind at the federal level. Now, that would encourage the federal people to collect all of the data for the 504 students, but that has yet to pass. As you know, at the federal government, it probably takes much more time than it would at the state level. So when will that happen? We're not sure, but in enforcing 504 to do these things, we really have had so many long discussions over the years, and I've been really struggling with the state. And it's really a struggle for not just our state, but for any other state as well. But what we're trying to do is make sure that the 504 students with hearing loss are given the language and communication plan and have that discussed. If that happens, then at that point, we can enforce the language assessments for those kinds of students. So that's where we're kind of in a bind at this point.
Susan Yankee. The reason I was proposing this is my son just had his 504 evaluation. He used to be on an IEP. That's why I knew about the language and communication plan. I requested it, and they looked up online, and then they said, we are not required to give that to you. And so they didn't. And so I called the Office of Disabilities in Massachusetts, and they said that they really could not help me. Yes, they said, because my son has communication criteria in place. So he's not being denied it in a sense. They said that I could come as a group action with other parents, but not as an individual. So that's why I was proposing the 504, but they literally looked at each other and said, we're not required to have that filled out.
So I guess my question would be to Jeff, are there other states that have tried to figure this out? And if so, let's try and get how, so nobody has addressed this just by you shaking your head.
I really wish there was another state that had passed this. It would be nice if Connecticut would be the first, but it's truly been a struggle because of the federal and state regulations. It is what it is. So, but if you pass that 504 students identified with hearing loss, then it wouldn't matter what degree of hearing loss. You're forcing them to discuss the language and communication plans. Now, will that hold any water? I don't know. But, you know, I really applaud your ambition, Susan. Any further discussion?
It seems that we're not